So this is our agenda. We're going to be looking at an overview of really kind of the requirements around documentation. We're going to talk a little bit about documentation by practice family. We're going to take a look at some extras related to documentation, and then we're going to finish up with a couple of final thoughts and some time for Q&A. So as we think about documentation and the overview for documentation, our goal really is to provide organizations seeking certification with the recommended documentation they need for certification. And then that's really kind of the point of this series of different slides and webinars that we're going to be focusing on over the next couple of months. So the first webinar is going to talk about CMMC basics around documentation, what you need to look for, what you should expect your assessor to look for, which is also very important. The second one will be more of a deep dive into the top 5 essential documents for CMMC. And these are going to be one of the documentation and the pieces of those documentation documents that are often missed. So we're going to deep dive into it to really give you some details around how you can make your documentation successful. The third thing that we're going to take a look at in the third session is the system security plan. And we all know that that's one of the essential documents as well, but that one really kind of deserves its own session. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with the fourth webinar, which is going to focus on building out CMMC diagrams and data flows. We know that that's a very important part of your CMMC environment. Without the correct diagrams and data flows especially, it's really difficult to assess and to really kind of pin down your environment. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. Okay. So let's take a look at documentation by practice family. When we take a look at our documentation as a whole, it can really kind of be broken down into these 14 practice families. And these are hopefully familiar to you by now. And when we look at the documentation or document count for each of the practice families, you can see that there's a number of different documents that are required. Now, the good thing about this is that for many of these practice families, the same document can be used multiple times. It can be reused in different families. For example, access control. Access control has 14 documents that we count. But out of those 14 documents, most of those documents can be used, again, for similar families like identification and authentication and audit and accountability. So you're not really creating this total number of documents for everything. The documentation, again, can be reused across different families. And the thing to keep in mind, too, about these documents is that these are our recommendations for documents that you may want to have. It is not necessarily an absolute list of all the documents that you need. In some cases, it may be more documentation that you need, but for the most part, this is going to put you right in the middle of where you need to be as far as documentation is concerned. So don't let this throw you off. Don't let this scare you too much. But there are a number of documents in here that can be reused for multiple purposes. Okay, so let's get right into the first one. The first control family, which is access control. Access control is one of the foundational practices that we have for CMMC, and as you can see, it can be the documentation that you need for access control can be used again in multiple areas, but it's also one of the most difficult documentation families to complete, and that's because we all usually have some type of access control policy or process in place, but normally that may not be fully documented, and it tends to deviate back and forth. So when I say it's one of the most difficult ones, it's not necessarily technically one of the most difficult ones, but it is one of the most difficult ones to make sure that your documentation is consistent and coherent all the way through with all of the touching points and the hooks that the access control family really utilizes. Okay, so my tip for this family for access control is to spend a little extra time on this one. Make sure that you do access control first, and then reuse a lot of the formats and the templates that you created with access control later on in some of the other control families. And as we look through this list of recommended documentation for each of the practice families, you will see that it's very relevant for a lot of different areas, and it'll make things easier if you do it that way. So spend an extra time up front, make sure you have all your policies and your procedures and your formats and your templates, have them laid out, know how you want to use them, and then always keep referring back to access control because it hooks into so many of the different practice families. Okay. Next, we're going to take a look at awareness and training. Awareness and training is it's one of the more straightforward ones. It's important because as we know, most of the breaches that occur inside of an environment are based on users. So CMMC puts a lot of importance on awareness and training. And some things to keep in mind for awareness and training is that you want to make sure that your documentation includes both on-site and off-site employees. So many of us have work-from-home employees or off-site employees. CMMC uses the term alternate worksite employees. So we want to make sure that our training includes both of those areas and is fully documented about how those different types of users are trained inside of the environment. Now, one thing that people often miss with the documentation for awareness and training is that they miss the fact that not only do you have to have training content, but you also have to have training procedures that describes how your training program is functioning, how it works. When is training provided? Who is training provided to? What does the training contain? Those kind of things. So you want to make sure that you have some type of procedure that talks about how your training program actually works. Okay. So my tip for awareness and training is that the training materials don't have to necessarily be elaborate. There are a ton of free resources out there, as well as paid resources, that are available for organizations that want to do their own training or want to use a low-cost or free method of doing training. If you Google out there, you'll find there's a ton of different aspects that you can use or tools that you can use to develop your own training. So it doesn't have to be difficult; it just has to be consistent and compliant with the practice requirement. Okay. So next, we're going to take a look at audit and accountability. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have mentioned earlier that you don't have to worry about frantically writing notes for this. I will send out this presentation along with another tool related to how you can manage your documentation following the webinar. So I'm moving through these pretty quickly because we only have 1 hour. So don't worry about taking notes. I will provide all of my notes and information to you guys so you'll have it easily, readily available. Okay. Audit and accountability. So audit and accountability, as you know, just based on the name, is going to look at your logging capability. If you have a SIM tool or security information event monitoring tool, this is where you will want to reach out to your internal team if you're managing it internally, or if you're using a managed service provider or a managed security service provider, or even a CSP. You want to make sure that you reach out to them and get their assistance. The documentation for this area is going to really require some of the details, especially the procedures. And when we look at the procedures for this, this is kind of in addition to the access control family, this is going to be where we're going to start to record a lot of our parameters around logging, right? So these are the parameters around, what is being logged, how often a log's reviewed, how often a log's rotated, how long are logs kept, when are logs deleted, all those kind of things. What constitutes an alert, what triggers an alert, all those kind of things are going to be things that are going to be stored as a standard, right? So the standard is really looking at the parameters related to a certain type of technology or a certain type of process inside of your environment. And a good example of a standard would be password protection, good AC control, or password length. So when we're looking at password length, how long are your passwords? Some folks say the passwords are 12, some are 16, some are longer, some are shorter. But that's where you would record that parameter related to your security in your information security standard. Okay, so here's my tip for the AU family. create a system for documenting the specifics around your monitoring capabilities. All right, so that could be that procedure that we were just talking about. This includes who performs the monitoring, how are events correlated, and how are they alerted on, what triggers an event, what triggers an alert, what rolls up an event into an alert, what rolls up maybe an alert into an incident. So all those types of things are the things that you will really want to be able to answer with your audit and accountability documentation. All right, so configuration management. This is a family that's one of the foundational families that's really related to a lot of other families like system and communications protection, system and integrity, information integrity, and also risk management. So what we always tell clients is that when we look at your change management and your configuration management programs, if your change management program is flimsy, then that's an overall indicator of your security program's health. What I mean by that is that if you're not keeping track of changes that are inside of your document or inside of your environment and it's not very well documented, you may be doing it, it may be ad hoc, but it's not documented, then that's going to mean that the rest of your program is maybe suspect, may not be in place, or may not be functioning the way that you think it's functioning. So you want to make sure that you spend some time, think through your configuration management program, and make sure that your change management, that one aspect of configuration management, is fully being documented and is fully covered. Here are a couple of tips. Your configuration management documentation should include the tools and processes used for change management. Right? So we want to make sure that you include things like your ticketing system, your change review boards if you have those, or any other system that you use for tracking changes inside of your environment. And then you also, and this is a big one because this is one that many organizations struggle with, don't forget to document the use of essential and non-essential programs, functions, ports, protocols, and services. Right? So that's one of the CM controls that you will have to, level 2 CM controls that you'll have to make sure that you fully document. So a lot of times we may document ports, protocols, and services. We're all familiar with that. But if you forget things like essential and non-essential programs, ports, protocols, and services and functions, then you will not meet the control requirement. So make sure that you look through those very well and document all of those various aspects in your documentation. All right, so next we're going to take a look at identification and authentication. So one of the things about identification and authentication, as you may be already aware of, is that very tightly integrated with the access control family. So when we were earlier, we were talking about access control and spending time going through the access control practices and making sure that you kind of flesh them out. This is where it really pays off. You can take a lot of that information you gained in the access control family and use that information for identification and authentication. So it's not, you won't be wasting work. You can reuse a lot of that. And then a very, very important tip for identification and authentication. Don't forget to classify your information. Don't forget your data classification aspect of it. There are controls in IA that reference data classification. You want to make sure that that data classification scheme, process, program, schedule, table, however you do it, you want to make sure that that is fully documented. Okay? Because if you don't, your assessor is going to say, well, you can't really protect these things at the right level if they're not classified. So you want to make sure that your data is classified and that it's correctly classified, and then that is the schema that you follow all throughout the rest of your documentation. All right, moving on, incident response. Incident response is one of the easy ones, in my opinion, the more straightforward ones. The reason I say that is because there are a lot of templates out there for incident response. There's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of help, free help out there that you can get for incident response. You could go to any number of organizations that can give you an incident response plan or process that you can put in place. Now, the thing about incident response that you want to keep in mind with your documentation is that when we think about incident response, we always think about you know, how I'll respond to an incident, who do I need to bring in from the outside, and all those kind of things. A forensics partner, some other third-party partner, and all that is true. But you also want to make sure that you include things like your internal groups, like business continuity and disaster recovery. All those areas have a play when it comes to incident response. So your plan should include all that. Your documentation should make sure you include all of those internal departments as well as external departments. And then if you do that, then you're going to have a good information or information security incident response plan. And then, of course, you know, make sure you have all the contact information for anybody that's listed in your incident response plan. And obviously, you don't want to put it by person because the person can change, but you may want to consider it by role or some other responsibility matrix that you have. Okay. All right. So next, maintenance. Maintenance is a pretty straightforward one as well. A lot of what you produce in the maintenance documentation family is going to be dependent upon how your organization or your CUI environment is structured. If a lot of your environment is in the cloud, then you may not have a lot of documentation. If you do have a data center and you have folks that are coming in and performing maintenance on systems in the data center, or even not necessarily just systems, but it could also include things like your HVAC or your system for fire detection and things like that. All those have to be included in your maintenance documentation. So depending upon what you have, you want to make sure that you have enough in there to satisfy the requirement. And even if you are using a cloud service provider, you want to make sure that you're including their information on how they handle it, especially if they have documentation that they can pass out. If they have an ATO or something like that, then obviously it makes it a little bit easier. But if they don't, then you'll have to make sure that you address that appropriately. One of the things to remember that's in our tip down here for maintenance is that you may be able to inherit many of those practice requirements like we just mentioned, but you want to make sure that you consult your responsibility matrix to see what can be inherited, what cannot be inherited, and what may be a hybrid or partially inherited. So make sure that that responsibility matrix is consulted really when you're going through any of these controls to make sure that you know, you have the responsibility laid out for each of these practices and or controls, and that you know, everything is being addressed appropriately. Okay, media protection. Media protection, again, is one of those areas where it touches so many different aspects of the environment. Things to keep in mind about media protection is that you want to make sure that it's consistent with your data classification and your data handling guidelines. And that's important. We talked about data handling and data classification a little bit earlier, but when you talk about media protection, people often forget that data handling is part of media. It's part of media inside of your environment. So when you look at that, you want to make sure that you're comparing that to kind of how you have data classified will definitely affect how it's handled. It'll affect how it's being protected. And it also should affect how it's being backed up and how it's recovered. So make sure that all of those areas are addressed in your documentation, because it's not just media protection doesn't stand on its own. It's really dependent, and other areas are dependent upon it. So make sure that you address that. My tip for media protection is around data retention. So you want to make sure that you have a data retention schedule and a policy. And you also want to make sure that all your personnel that are working that have access to media or data, that they understand what the data retention policy or schedule is. They have to be trained on it. So if they're not trained on it, then it's like we say in this business, if you can't prove that they're trained on it, then they don't know it. So you need to make sure that they are trained on it, and then that is fully documented in your processes that you're putting together, or your documentation that you're putting together for media protection. All right, personnel security. This is an easy one. This one is the one that gives you a chance to catch your breath. Gives me a chance to catch my breath as well. So when we look at personnel security, we're really kind of looking at the documentation around the hire and termination procedures, as well as documentation around things like background checks, leave of absence, temporary employees, contractors, those kind of things. And for the most part, technical folks aren't going to have that information. We typically don't manage that, but human resources usually can be of great assistance in helping to provide that information. So this is definitely one of the areas where you will want to reach out to your HR department and get them to help with answering these questions. One of the things that I didn't put down here in the tip that I did want to mention about personnel security is that you will want to make sure that your personnel security documentation not only covers the processes up to hire, like background checks and training and bringing someone on, but it also covers what happens once someone leaves the organization, right? So once a person is terminated, what happens? Are they notified of certain responsibilities around maybe their NDA or something else that they sign inside the organization that protects data? How is that handled? Those kind of things. So just don't assume that termination is the end of the documentation. You need to make sure that that documentation goes all the way through and fully addresses at least the 2 requirements that are stated here, or I think it's 2 controls or practices that are stated under physical or personnel security. Pretty straightforward again, but just make sure that you're doing a complete job on the documentation. All right, so next one is one that we're all familiar with. It's the physical protection, the PE controls. Again, this is one that relates to, or the level of effort is related to how much of this is a virtual environment versus a physical environment. If you have a physical environment or on-prem environment, then obviously, a lot of these are really going to apply, may require a little bit more documentation effort. If you have work from home employees, same thing. And also it's good to keep in mind that work from home employees or alternate worksite employees, they still have a physical security requirement that they have to meet. So just because they work from home and the assessor is not going to go out and check their home, it doesn't mean that they don't have that requirement to meet. So there's certain things that you can do or put in place. One of the things that we did, since we have work from home employees, is that we created an alternate worksite procedure. So that procedure tells what they must do from a physical perspective. Their monitor can't be visible from an outside window. They have to have access control in an area. It can't be a public area, things like that. So, and then we have also a random checklist that we go through for employees to validate that they have these things in place, and that has been pretty successful for us as far as making sure that some of these work from home employees are still meeting the requirement, the practice requirement. And then here's the tip. If your environment is housed in a FedRAMP compliant CSP, you may be able to inherit many of those physical controls from them. So you want to consult your CSP or consult your MSP to make sure that they do meet the requirements. And I know that many of the requirements around MSPs and MSSPs are still up in the air, and we'll have more information on that once the final rule is finished. But for right now, you still will want to reach out to your CSP and find out where they are, or your MSP and find out where they are as far as this is concerned, the physical security controls. Okay. Risk assessment. All right. So this is one of the biggies. There's not a lot of control requirements as far as documentation for risk assessments, but this is one that can be kind of tricky. It can be difficult to really kind of fill out all that information, especially if you kind of are doing it from sort of a catch-up perspective. And what I mean by that is that if you build out your risk management program from the start and you documented it from the start, then it can be fairly easy to implement. But if you are going back after the fact and trying to develop a risk management program, then it can be difficult. So this is one And as I mentioned there in my tip, this is one that you want to develop from a strategic point of view. You don't want to, as I mentioned, start later on. You want to start early in the process with management, and you want to make sure that management understands that you're trying to build a risk management program and document it from the ground up. So that includes everything that you have in your risk management program. It includes all of your feeds into your risk management program, whether that's pen testing, vulnerability scanning, some other type of scanning, SIM tools and solutions. All of those things will feed into your risk assessment and your risk management program. So you want to make sure you document all of those different tools. And then you also need to have an ongoing aspect to it, you know, kind of that continuous monitoring aspect to it, which is where your risk register would come into play, right? And then you also need to have a vulnerability mitigation plan or vulnerability management plan, however you want to say that, to make sure that when you're identifying things that cause risk to the organization, you have a way to go through and to mitigate those vulnerabilities and reduce that level of risk to an acceptable level inside of your organization. So, like I said, it doesn't have a lot of components to it, but the components that you have to build out for this one can be difficult. So this is where you may want to reach out for someone for help if you don't have a plan already in place and documented. All right, so we're getting closer to the end. We got two more after this one. Security assessment. So this is where we're looking at things about, you know, how are we doing security assessments inside of the organization? We need to document, you know, what's our strategy around pen testing? What's our strategy around vulnerability assessments? And of course, this area fits very closely with the risk management and the vulnerability management processes. One thing to keep in mind with this one is that the security assessment aspect of our environment cannot be set it and forget it. What I mean by that is that as you set up documentation for your organization, you know, you'll kind of document what the current state is, and which is what you absolutely must do. But when you're looking at things like vulnerability scanning and feeds that are coming off of your SIM, you're looking at pen testing, other types of scanning that may occur in your environment. It's not about just setting the tool up and just letting it run. It's really about managing that risk, managing that vulnerability process, and using the security assessment aspect of this control or this practice family to do that. Now, you need to also make sure that obviously we just mentioned earlier about the system security plan. System security plan is part of the security assessment control family. All right, and in that control, there are a number of minimum requirements for your system security plan. So you need to make sure that that is fully documented. Not only documented in your system, not only does your system security plan meet those requirements, but you want to make sure that you know, any other requirements that aren't being met or maybe documented somewhere else are addressed, and that you fully cover everything related to this one. So security assessment is not just about vulnerability scanning, and documentation shouldn't just be about vulnerability scanning. You have to make sure that you have a continuous process, and you're leaning more towards that continuous process documentation than you are anything else, because that's really what it is. It's not set it and forget it. It's an ongoing documentation. It's an ongoing, people call it a living document that you have to set up and make sure that that's fully documented. All right, so here's my tip around security assessment. You have to ensure that your plan of action and milestones, or your POAMs, they include the minimum requirements that are specified in the CMMC 2.0 requirements, and that's ownership, accountability, specific remediation steps that are clear and actionable, a way to measure progress, and minimum a completion date. So most of our POAMs will have more information to this than this, but this is the minimum that you need to have in place to make sure that you're meeting the minimum requirements. Okay. So if you, and I'll just kind of throw this in here too. If you have, or if you need a POAM template, feel free to reach out to me. I can get you a POAM one. But there's also many templates that are out there. There's actually one out there for the DoD. that, and I think it's one specifically the 800-171 that you may want to use as well. So a couple of different sources out there, free sources that you can use for POAM if you don't already have a template that you like. Okay, so systems and communications protection. Right. So this is the other one of the larger practice families. And as you know, system and communication protection is really focusing on more the technical side of things. So it's looking at IDS, IPS, it's looking at voice over IP, it's looking at firewalls, it's looking at all of those different technical systems that you have that are either protecting the environment as a security protection device or maybe in the environment as part of the environment itself. Which, again, what you want to do for this one, you also want to make sure that each of those security parameters are included in that information security standards document. And then this is a kind of a tip, but I put it up top. It's a good idea that if you're using some of these different tools, that you start to develop a vendor library or a vendor data sheet library that kind of talks about how their product supports the CMMC practice requirements. And I encourage you to do that if you haven't already started doing that as part of your documentation processes, because once you get down to the point of you're providing artifacts, you go through, you do your demonstration for your assessor, they take a look at your technology, and say, yeah, it meets this, and then, they say, well, show me how it meets FIPS 140-2 requirements. And it may not be a direct button in the software or the interface that says it's FIPS 140-2, but their documentation may support it. So you may want to make sure that you have that documentation in place and it's there available if you need it. All right, so here's our tip for systems and communication protection. As you build out the technical side of the implementation, you want to document each of the new technologies in your network diagram and your CUI data flow diagram. And the reason I say that is because as you're going through and you're kind of developing all of this documentation sort of in parallel, it's easy for it to get out of sync. So as you're going through and you're implementing technology, you're changing technology, you're moving technology, you're identifying technology, make sure that that technology is reflected in your diagrams, because then you can always go back and make sure that those diagrams are consistent with your inventory, and your inventory is consistent with your SSP, those kind of things. So you can see it's kind of a chain reaction that you want to build up. You want to make sure that all that diagram goes through sort of a data flow, all that documentation goes through a data flow as you're building out. It's really difficult to keep it consistent if you're making changes to multiple documents at multiple times through multiple people. So you want to have a data flow that the documentation goes through from the beginning to the end so that all the appropriate changes are made all throughout that life cycle. All right, so this is the final one. Oops, I hit one. This is the final one, systems and information integrity. So when we're looking at systems and information integrity, we know that again is closely tied to vulnerability management. It's closely tied to the SC control that we just looked at, and it's also closely tied to integrity, right? So in this family, really, the kind of crux of this family is just really kind of to make sure that everything ticks and ties to one another, and you're protecting the integrity of that information appropriately, in this case, CUI information. One of the things that you need to make sure that you do, you want to make sure that authorized and unauthorized use of organizational systems is defined in your acceptable use policy. Most of us have an acceptable use policy that we require employees to sign. If you don't, you should. And if you don't have an acceptable use policy or decide not to use one, you need to make sure that authorized and unauthorized use is documented somewhere else. It needs to be included because that's one of the control requirements for SI. You also want to make sure that you're monitoring and that you have it documented in your documentation that you're looking at both inbound and outbound traffic, right? So it's just not inbound traffic like most of us will look at by default, but also outbound traffic. So you need to make sure that that's documented and that you fully describe what that process is. And then here's my tip. Ensure that you documented timeframes for system flaw identification, patching, reporting, etc., all realistic and achievable, right? So you don't want to document something and then not meet that documented requirement. It's better just to go back and change it to something that's realistic, something that you actually can achieve, because your assessor will be comparing your what you have documented against what you're actually doing, right? So make sure you're documenting according to what you can do as an organization. That's going to depend upon your workload. It's going to depend upon the resources that you have available, and many times many other factors may play into that. So make sure that you're documenting what you can achieve and not documenting what you want to achieve. All right. Okay, so we're going to talk just a few minutes about documentation extras, and then I'm going to leave a few minutes for comments. So documentation extras, common documents. So some of the common documents for CMMC include the ones that are listed here. I won't read through them, but you want to make sure that these documents are covering all of your practice requirements. So information security policy can be a single or can be multiple documents. Same thing with that information security standard that I mentioned earlier. We created ours as a single document that contained all of our policy. We created our information security standard as a single document that maintained or contained all of our parameters around all of our controls or practices rather. So, but some organizations want to do multiple documents. So it's up to you how you want to address it, but you want to make sure that you have that common document in place. Things like the system security plan are pretty much a no-brainer. You know you need to have that. We'll talk more about that one of the future webinars. This is one I do want to highlight a little bit though, systems and application inventory. So one of the things that's required for CMMC is an inventory of all of your CUI systems, and not just CUI systems, but also the supporting systems or the security protection devices that may be applicable to your environment for CMMC. There's no absolute way that it has that table or chart or however you put it together has to be formatted, but you do want to make sure that it's meeting the minimum requirements that's in the CMMC documentation. If you don't know what those minimum requirements are, just let me know. I can send you some information on that. But that's very important because, as we mentioned earlier, that inventory really is the basis for what your assessor will look through when he reads your documentation to make sure that they're addressing all of the areas appropriately. So if an inventory doesn't have any mobile devices, then they're going to verify that, and there's no point in asking about mobile devices. But if it does have, work from home users or various other systems that they need to follow up on, then that needs to be fully documented in that inventory. And then this is just just some advice. When that inventory should match up one-to-one with your CUI data flow and any other CUI diagrams that you have to make sure that they're consistent. If there's things missing on one and included on the other, then that's going to raise questions. So you want to make sure that that documentation is consistent, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide. The rest of the other diagrams or the rest of the documents in here that are mentioned, I think you're pretty familiar with at this point. The one that you may have spent a lot of time on is continuous monitoring strategy. That again, that's going to kind of tie into your CA controls and your risk assessment controls. That's going to talk about what is your monitoring strategy overall, right? Not the fact that you're doing monitoring, but what's your continuous monitoring strategy to make sure that it's not set and forget. It's something that's being monitored and kept up to date throughout the entire life cycle. Okay, and then the final one I'll mention on here is responsibility matrix. That's a big one. As we mentioned, the responsibility matrix needs to show for each of the practices who's responsible for that practice. Is it your cloud service provider? Is it your managed security or services provider or managed security services provider? Is it you as an organization, or is it a mix of the two? So you want to make sure that that's included. If you are using Microsoft has a Microsoft placemat That's their responsibility matrix for the CMMC requirements. Same thing with AWS. They also have an AWS responsibility matrix that will outline, depending upon which service you're using for AWS and Microsoft, will outline what they have responsibility for and what's your responsibility. Okay, all right. So what do assessors look for? Well, as assessors go through their assessment, they're really looking for these 4 things, primary things. They're looking to make sure that your documentation is consistent. So they're looking for consistency in the document itself compared to other parts of the document. They're also looking for consistency as far as how the document compares to other documents in your document library. Right? So if you say your password parameter is 12 here, but then you say it's 8 somewhere else in another document, then that shows that your documentation is not consistent. And it may raise questions as to whether other parts of your documentation is consistent or are consistent. The second point is adequate and sufficient. Right? So in this one, they're looking to find out, is there enough information provided for me to assess this practice? If it's not, then that may cause an issue. Some cases, we can come back and we can ask for additional information, but in some cases, then it's an indicator that you just don't have that control implemented correctly. And this one is important. Is the information relevant to the topic? You want to make sure that your documentation is specific to what you're documenting, right? Don't go off into left field or to right field and start talking about stuff that's not relevant, because that's going to lose your assessor, your audience, and it's not going to make your documentation useful. It's going to cause questions or issues, or could even at some point, if it's prevalent, could cause a practice to fail. So you want to make sure that it's relevant to the topic or relevant to what you're trying to address. We talked about this one a little bit. You have to make sure that your information is current. Right? So it should relate to what the current state of your environment, not what you want the environment to look like. It's what the environment looks like. So that's what the assessor is looking at. It's kind of a point-in-time assessment. So they need to understand what the current state of the environment is. And most documentation will not change, but for whatever reason, if there's a last-minute change to something inside your environment, you need to make sure that that's updated throughout all of your documentation where it's relevant, and that you're presenting the current state and not what the future state is, or some old state even. And then this last one is very, very important. You want to make sure that your documentation is easy to understand, and that means that it's clear, it's to the point, it's concise, it's succinct, whatever other words you want to use. You want to make sure that your documentation is getting to the point, because there's nothing worse than reading through a ton of documentation and never really answering the question. All right. A good way to do that is, if you look at your system security plan, there's a section called implementation details. You want to make sure that when you're providing the implementation details for whatever practice it is, that it's a quick, succinct doc or section in that document. Should not be pages and pages long. It should just be clear and to the point. And if you need to reference out to some other document, say for example, if you are talking about some of the security parameters and you need to reference out to the security standards document, then provide references in your documentation, and then make sure that those references are accurate, right? So some people include in their documentation a reference table, or sometimes they may have a documentation tool that includes the references. If you do have that, then that's great. Provide that as part of your documentation. But if you don't, just make sure that your information is clear, to the point, and concise, because that really is a huge factor in how assessors look at an environment. All right, that brings me to the end, and I would like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. I know that this is just some basic information, but hopefully you got at least some tips out of the information, out of the presentation. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. If you have anything that I mentioned on here that you may want some additional information, I'd be happy to provide that. And hope you guys have a good rest of the week, and hopefully be talking to you very soon.